I'm Bill Ball. I'm the Air Water Program Manager here at Acadia. And just as a kind of introduction here, back in 2006, we started our stream monitoring program here at Acadia as part of the Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program Northeast Temperate Network. Developed a protocol for stream monitoring. This is the first time that we've done any sort of water. That was the first time we did any water quality or water quantity monitoring of the streams by park staff on a regular basis. So that was really the beginning of our data history. Lombard was one of the primary authors of the protocol. And after 15 years of data collection, we decided it was about time that we did an evaluation of how we've been doing in that process. So, we worked with Pam and Nick through the USGS and National Park Service Natural Resource Preservation Program and computer funding in order to get this this analysis done. And as part of this, we examined the past data that we've been collecting over the past 15 years. We looked at the hands-on techniques that we use to collect our water quantity data. And then also Pam analyzed the data that we collected and tried to determine how well some of the 17 streams that we monitor on a monthly basis might be used to relate to the Otter Creek stream gauge, which was established with USGS as a continuous record station back in 2006 as the index. So basically, the stream gauge is supported by half and half by funding from Friends of Acadia and by the Northeast Temperate Network, the NTN. So it's really good to know that we're getting a lot of bang for our buck. And to explain exactly how it works.
Thank you.
I gotta have to pause for just a second. We're having a technical difficulty. I think the sound quality is so I'm gonna pause the recording. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Bill, for the introduction. So yeah, I'm Pam Lombard, and I work at the USGS New England Water Science Center, and I work out of the main office and have for a long time. And so also we have Megan McAllister and Nina Labrie, and they are going to be working on the next iteration. So it's really exciting to put this presentation together because we're going back to 2006 and all the work we did then, and then we did a review, and then we're going to be moving into the next stage of the water quantity type work. And so we'll talk a little bit about all of those. And Nick Stasulis could not be here, but he was definitely an integral part of this phase of analyzing the data and the network and everything. So it's been a great collaboration and excited to continue it. So I'm going to go back also to 2006. And so the freshwater vital signs monitoring plan as a part of the Northeast Temperate Network is how this all got started, and Bill and others were a part of that. We did it in 3 phases. We did a scoping report and did this fancy water quantity diagram, just an inventory of freshwater resources at Acadia and at the other Northeast Temperate Network monuments. And then we had a workshop, did phase 2 selection of the water quality and quantity monitoring variables, and decided what the vital signs were going to be that we're going to monitor. And then phase 3 was developing the water quality monitoring protocols. And so this is you're still working off an iteration of that original, those original protocols. So one of the vital signs that was identified during that whole process was to detect changes in stream flow at Acadia over time. And so, in terms of better understanding the ecology and extreme weather, climate change, and really supporting an understanding of the water quality data and be able to compute loads and such, guide management decisions, inform facility and maintenance. So everyone, all the professionals at the workshop decided changes in stream flow was important to monitor. And so then you all initiated your network in 2006. Not to say you hadn't been measuring water quantity in streams before that, but this is where this recent iteration of the network got started. So I'm going to take a minute just to talk about measuring stream flow and sort of in the order of accuracy of how you could go about this. So, and the pros and cons of some of the different ways. So the most accurate, the best way is to measure it. Just go measure stream flow, right? And so the pros of that would be you have a very accurate instantaneous measurement, but you don't have the cons of it is it's just that one location and it's that one point in time. So the next best and really best is the continuous record stream gauge, because you're measuring also just the one location, but you're measuring it continuously. So for Otter Creek, it's 5-minute intervals, and you're measuring stage or the elevation of the stream. And then you're going out and taking a measurement and getting that stage measurement and developing a relationship or a stage discharge rating to be able to get that stream flow estimate in real time, over the web. So that's really the gold standard in terms of stream flow, is that continuous record stream gauge. But the downside of that is, once again, so you have the continuity in time, but not in space. And it's expensive. It's a lot of work to do that continuous record stream gauge. So now when we want to expand that over space, one way to go about that is the partial record stream gauging stations. And so that is the network that you've got going on here. And that's where you measure on a fixed interval. You go out once a month or once a week or whenever you actually need a measurement, whenever you're getting a water quality sample, and you're taking that measurement. And then you come and try to see if you can set up a relationship with a continuous record stream gauge. And so if you can correlate the two, then you could then have an estimate of stream flow at any of those partial record stations anytime that you have a measurement at your continuous record stream gauge. So once again, it's sort of limited. It's limited by the number of partial record stations you can do in a given season. And I would say the other con is that for this partial record network, it's low flows. It's summer flows, because you're taking measurements May through October. And so that the estimates and the correlations, and this is all what I'm going to be talking about today, is really only applies during those months that you actually took measurements, because we don't know how the relationship holds up during the winter or during high flows. There is another type of partial record stream gauging network you can do for high flows, and that's a crest stage gauge network, where you can get a peak every, it's pretty much a high water mark, and then you come back and reset it, and so you can develop a stage discharge relationship with those crest stage gauges if like high flows became an important thing you wanted to estimate, and seems like it is. So then the next best thing is really the regression equation. And so the regression equation, you're estimating a stream flow statistic instead of an instantaneous measurement. So you're saying, using this equation to estimate a peak flow, like a 50-year flow, 100-year flow, or a low flow, or August median. So any statistic that we've developed a regression equation for, you can use that to get a stream flow statistic. And so the pros of that is you can do it anywhere also. So I don't know if folks have used our Stream Stats application. You can point and click anywhere in Maine, and anywhere we have a regression equation or any statistic we have a regression equation for, you can get that statistic for that location. And the cons of that would be and especially this seems to be true for Acadia, that equation only applies within the bounds of the gauges that were used to develop the equation. So, we have a whole series of gauges that we developed our regression equations for, and let's say they went from 1 square mile, our smallest gauge, to 500 square miles. So that regression equation only applies within those bounds. So if you have a 0.2 square mile drainage area and you want to use the regression equation, it doesn't usually really apply. You're going to use it anyways if that's your best thing, but you're not going to know what the error is surrounding that equation. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, not only in terms of like drainage area, but the other basin characteristics. So like the percent wetlands or whatever basin characteristic went into that equation is outside the bounds of what was used to develop it. It may or may not apply. And you guys are outside the bounds on a lot of things. I'm just going to say that right up front when you try to estimate stream flow here, because of some of the extreme rainfalls and stuff that's going on. So your other alternatives, you can do a rainfall runoff model. I mean, we've done studies and the regression equations typically do better than the rainfall. I mean, we think that the regression equations are sort of the best way to estimate it without an actual measurement. Rainfall runoff model is also a good alternative, you know, and if you can calibrate it with some real measurements, that's going to be even better. Or you can use the rational method, which is, you know, your sort of more basic, just area plus a coefficient. So these are the types of, this is really what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about how we're using the partial record stations and how well they correlated to the index stations. So here is your stream gauging network. Now you have the one dark triangle, which is Otter Creek, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the other triangles are all the partial record stations. And this came out of the water quality monitoring plan, where we looked at all of the watersheds and tried to get good coverage throughout the park. And you also need a location where you can actually get a good measurement. So you're kind of restricted by that as well. This particular NRPP project was to assess this network's ability to meet the inventory and monitoring objectives that were initially set out for it. So there was a couple of parts of that. The first part was reviewing the data collection methods, as Bill mentioned. And then another big piece that we've all kind of been wondering is, we set up Otter Creek as a potential index gauge. Does it work? Is it a good index gauge? Do we know? And then if it is, can we develop equations where we can estimate stream flow at these partial record stations using Otter Creek? So it was time to review the network for sure. It was, you know, I mean, USGS, we're all about quality assurance and quality control. I mean, we review our networks every few years, but 10 years is really pushing it. We were at 15. We tried to push this through multiple times. I don't know if this was our second or third try, but it was time. And really great that we got this opportunity. So yeah, we looked at the data collection methods and then the ability of the network to meet the stated objectives. And so this was really, you know, the work that Nick did with Bill and with your other field folks, and went out and visited each station in the network and reviewed the reference marks. You know, part of that, you really want to be surveying them in. If you are, you know, trying to relate stage to discharge, you want to make sure your stage measuring points aren't moving. You want to assess the measuring location. Do you have a good hydraulic control where you're measuring in it? And is this a good location where you can measure at a whole different range of stream flows? And so we are constantly assessing that at our stream gauging locations. And we thought that, you know, this is somewhere we can help your all staff to just look at these locations objectively. Make sure you're all using the most accurate equipment. And I think Bill and Nick work together to, you know, get some of the equipment sent into our hydrologic instrumentation facility, the HIF, and provided some other equipment. But and that resulted in a project letter. It was sort of almost everything we do results in a report that's more available to the public. But that was sort of just a back and forth and a letter that went, and you all integrated most of those suggestions, I think, already. Okay, so here's, you know, this is your continuous record stream gauge, and it's Otter Creek. And like I said, it's every 5 minutes, and it's been going from 2006 to the present. And when we did the inventory monitoring plan, you know, one thing was, where should we do this continuous record stream gauge? We're only going to have one. Where should it be? And so, you know, we looked at some previous, this is not the first time you all tried to do correlations. There's been other iterations with Martha, Nilsson, and Tom, and so you had some other gauges. We looked at Cadillac and Hadlock, and the one other one that you used to measure continuously for a short term. But based on the measurements that we had taken and looked at, this seemed like a good alternative for being a continuous record. And so that's the one that we set up. And this is what, so we still maintain, the USGS maintains the continuous record stream gauge, and you all do the partial records. And here's the partial record stations. Like you're doing stage and discharge monthly, either annually, biannually every other year, May to October, since 2006. So what we're doing with these partial record stations and what the analysis piece of this project was to develop this MOVE-1, which is a maintenance of variance type equation between an index stream gauge and a partial record stream gauge. So you're looking at daily mean flow at the index station. So anytime that you all went out and took a monthly measurement at one of the partial record stations, you have an instantaneous value for stream flow. So we take the log of that and we correlate it with the daily mean flow at Otter Creek for that same day. And you plot it out. And so you could just be you could just use an ordinary least squares regression type line that shows up there too, but we found for stream gauging, it's the MOVE-1 is the most appropriate way to do this type of equation because it maintains preserves the mean and the variance at the partial record station. And so you put together this line and see how well it does. If you use the ordinary least squares, I think it overestimates the low flows and underestimates the high flows just a little bit, but also reasonable. So that's just some of the math behind it. And so when we came to do this analysis, we thought, well, Otter Creek is the one that we're thinking is going to be the best index gauge because of its location and because of its size. It's 1.3 square miles. But due diligence, we need to check all of our other continuous record stream gauges that are anywhere in the vicinity. Do they work better as an index gauge than does Otter? And we don't have a lot of, because sometimes like the basic characteristics of another gauge might line up, it has the same percentage wetlands or something like that. So we did test these other stations that have long-term records. You really need more than 10 years. That's, Otter Creek had 15 or whatever, which is not a lot for an index gauge. You really want more. But no surprise, Otter did better than any of these at all of the sites, except there was a couple that were sort of equivalent with like Libby, I think did it, but essentially it wasn't any better than Otter. And so we are, for this round of the analysis, we're using Otter to extend the record at all the partial record stations.
And how much do you have to take into account the differences in precipitation? Because I mean, that could be more of a variable even than watershed size and things like that, because oftentimes our precipitation is different than here than it would be in Narraguegas or, any of these.
Yeah, and that's why we don't, so first of all, I think you want it to more local the better, but also these relationships are during times of base flow. So I'm going to talk about that. They do not apply during times of direct runoff. Because that very thing, I mean, as we're seeing, one watershed's getting hit and another watershed isn't. So if Otter Creek is peaking or, close to the top of the hydrograph, if you're in direct runoff, the equations don't apply. So that's a big caveat.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the MOVE-1 equation. I put a very pretty picture of Aunt Betty's pond in the background to ease you into the math. But we're not going to talk about the math too much. Just to know that you have the stream flow at your index gauge, and you have a stream flow at your partial record site, and you can plug it into the equation. But when we develop the equations, we're really evaluating them based on the strength of the relation between the two states. So you're looking at the R squared, or the amount of variability in the estimate that is explained by the equation, and then the root mean squared error, like how comparing the measurement that you actually took versus one that was predicted using the equation. And so those are the diagnostics for these MOVE-1 equations. That's all I'm going to say about that. So unless anyone wants to know more. So here are the correlations between Otter Creek and the 14 partial record stations that we looked at. And you can see it's quite variable. Like you have like Marshall here is pretty beautiful, and so is Hunter. They correlate really well with Otter Creek. We did remove, in a few cases, if there was some measurement taken during a period of direct runoff at Otter Creek, we removed those measurements from this correlation analysis. But some of these other sites, you know, like Sargent and like Wood, also not super strong relationship there. And so we are using the cutoff, the R is the Pearson's correlation coefficient, and we used a cutoff of 0.8 as anything that had a correlation of 0.8 or greater, we developed a relation for. And so you can see those are in the green. And then there was these, you know, the 4 sites that, well, 3 sites actually had a correlation coefficient less than 0.8, and Duck Pond, yeah, had Duck Brook, yeah. It had a 0.83 correlation coefficient, but the root mean squared error at that site was terrible. It was way, way out of line, and so we also did not feel comfortable providing an equation for that site. So these are for these 10 sites in the report. We have the equations that we can estimate stream flow at these sites, or stream flow statistics based on what we've got going on at Otter. And here's again, these are the correlation coefficients, another just in tab format, the number of measurements that we used in the correlations. So we have at least 20 at all the sites, up to 40 at Stanley, and then the number of zero flow observations. So if we had a zero flow measurement at the partial record station, you can do a fancy logistic regression equation to see what's the chance that we think that using this equation that the partial record station is at 0 or less, and we don't have enough zero flow measurements to make that type of analysis meaningful at this time. So we just did it graphically. And so if you look at the graph and you say like it's sort of going off the end of the graph, there's a greater than 50% chance that that is going to be 0 at the partial record station. And that's sort of the approach I would take for now until we get more measurements and determine. So for all of the monthly statistics, we did not, there was a greater than 50% chance that they would not be 0. And so we came up with those equations. But those are the number of zero flows at the different sites. And then here are the equations. And so, and with their diagnostics as well. So you can put in the Q Otter there, get the daily mean flow at Otter, or I guess if you want to do it in real time, you could do the instantaneous as well, but these are really designed to come on the daily mean if you're doing them after the fact. And then you just plug it into the equation and get your estimate at the partial record site. And so you can do this either with an instantaneous flow or a daily flow or a statistic. So you could put in the August mean flow at Otter and get the August mean flow at the partial record site. And those we've done for you, and they are in the report. And although we do log transformed measurements, those are already incorporated into the equation. So you can just put straight flows into the equation. And so these are the mean monthly stream flows at the 10 partial record stations where we had the equations, and we also have the median monthly stream flows at those same sites. Those are both in the report. You can look at those. And we'll expect these to change over time. You get more measurements at Otter, you get more measurements at the partial record stations. You'd want to update these over time and look at them. So the limitations and the uncertainty with this, it's a single index station. So usually when we're doing move ones, or you have, larger projects where you're doing a lot of record extension to partial records, you really ideally would have a lot of continuous record stream gauges that you're testing and looking at. And so that would make it a little more balanced. And 16 years of record, like I said, it's great, but it's for, if you want to look at climate change, if you want to look at long-term statistics, you want your index site to have as long a record as possible. Some of our gauges have 100 years of record. So just to say, if you want to be looking at climate change, keep Otter going. It seems to be working as an index gauge, which is the question that we wanted to answer, but it's really important. Like we even say, okay, for peak flows, you you always use the entire period of record when you're doing an analysis. You need the entire history because the peak of record might have been, 60 years ago, whatever. For low flows, we say, well, only use the most recent 20 or 30 years because of climate change, but we don't even have 20 or, so we're looking at 16 years here, and it's a great start, but I would just encourage you to continue that as one piece, that you're starting to have a longer record at. The other limitations, you have limited number of partial record stations, and really the limitation is the May through October piece, not having the winter measurements. And as we're starting, we'll talk about the new project that's coming up and really wanting to understand flooding and high flows better. And water quality loads and such. It's really hard when you're just looking at these low flows or base flows. And then the equations will be expected to change when you have more data. So we should review them from time to time. And you really, as the user, need to decide whether the accuracy of equations meets your needs. Is this, what are you looking for? How are you looking to use it? Any regression equation is only as good as, the stated accuracy. And so, maybe you need to go measure it that day if you really need something accurate. I mean, they are what they are, and can be super helpful, but just look at the accuracy when you're using them. So yeah, the takeaway, Otter Creek Stream Gauge is a good index site. 10 good, decent correlations, I think is really good. And more years of record would be important. And I already said this, the high flow measurement not really being captured except at Otter Creek. We're talking about all these different projects we've come together. This really pulls together a lot of it, but the Great Meadows projects, when we did the hydraulic analysis, the hydrology was really hard there because, so if you look at we didn't have really that many measurements. We didn't have any measurements during high flow. You think, well, Otter Creek is right next door and the drainage areas are really very similar between Otter Creek and Great Meadows. But the equation, so you can, I didn't really talk about that, but you can transfer, over to another basin. If that's another way to get at some stream flow. I tried to transfer and it didn't work. The steepness of Otter Creek and the wetlands at Great Meadow, the estimates didn't make any sense at all. So then we used the regression equations at Great Meadows to get at a hydrology. And I think that's the best available. And so that's what we used. But I think, you have a lot of other stuff going on here. If we had some other sites that we could use or some other measurements that we could use to start seeing it, what makes sense and are these regression equations appropriate for use here? I think that's important.
I just coincidentally was reading BHP's hydraulic report for Great Meadow for another from answering questions, but yeah, they looked at the regression equations and they thought maybe it was the wetlands, like the earlier one. It's just completely different, they're adjacent.
The wetlands is out of bounds, so if you look at the equations, the wetlands for Great Meadows is larger than, or a greater percentage. So I don't know, the equation, the peak flows, it's like 0 to 30% wetlands, I think was, the percent wetlands that goes into the equation. And I don't remember exactly what Great Meadows is, but it's pretty different acting than some of the others.
They ended up building a giant model for the wetland BHP.
I talked to the guy who took the Great Meadows, I think, the hydraulic model and turning it into the 2D model. It's interesting to see that. Okay, so the products here are the USGS report, which is available online. You can just Google that 2022 5126, or you can find it. We have the USGS data release that has all of the code that we use to do the move one. So if you want to redo those, you can do that. And we do have all the partial record station measurements. And I know you all keep those also internally, but we had to publish them as part of our analysis. So they're available on that data release. That's a permanent URL that you can have them stored. And then we had that data collection methods review letter that Nick had put together. Okay, so does anyone have questions about that before I move a little bit? We're going to briefly talk about the new project, but I'm happy to take any questions about that current project.
I should know this, but how far back do our other stream gauges go? So the continuous measurement is only 16 years. But do we have stream gauge records from previous to that?
Yeah,
We used to have stream gauges at Cadillac and Hadlock Brooks that went from, I think it was 1996 through 2006. So it's,
So we don't have anything like even approaching like the 100-year, 50-year,
nope,
like, so everything is 90s or newer?
yeah.
Okay.
And nothing certainly that long-term, that contiguous in one location.
Hmm.
So that's exactly why we need,
That's annoying.
you know,
So what?
to keep
That's
on.
unfortunate.
perpetuating.
annoying.
Yeah,
Okay.
and, you know, I mean, had Cadillac and Hadlock were great because you had a lot of years of record there, but they're so tiny. So I mean, we tried to do correlations with those when we were testing, and they're just so small that, you know, it's hard to have them correlate really well with the other sites.
Is that probably why we didn't have gauges in the first place? Is because our terrain is so weird? Like, we're not very useful for measuring anywhere else? Why would we have not been gauged before as a national park for 100 years?
It's a very good question. I mean, it's all a question of funding. I mean, even Otter Creek has been is hard, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're expensive. And so for the crest, I mean, crest stage gauges are also great. The only problem with, and that's for peak flows, but they're a piece of metal on the landscape, which is not ideal here. And they're hard. So if we're doing them, you know, your watersheds peak really quickly. So we have to get someone, you know, when a storm's coming, we need to often measure at the peak. And so that's the challenge with measuring the peaks here. I mean, it's great when you guys are measuring them here, but in terms of doing high flows, I think having the equipment and having the experience, it's really good to have people who are doing that every day, you know. But I don't know, that's a very good question.
that's on Jake's work plan for the next.
Those 3 AM ones are the ones.
I mean, it's not a hard sell to have our folks come out either. This is always good. Does anyone have other questions about this particular work?
Well, the only missing piece to this is actually, we should figure out how we're gonna continue to maintain this, you know, the equations and set up some way that we can continue to contribute the new data that we're collecting,
Yeah,
you know, and keep that going and kind of figure out a way to keep this process, you know,
current, yeah.
current and useful.
And I think, I mean, also the other piece though, the part that Nick and you did together, I mean, that's also critical, you know, I mean, your data is only as good as, you know, if your measuring location has shifted, you get a big storm and I mean, everything changes in the stream, but you know, that may not be a great location anymore. I mean, you need to be able to evaluate that and maybe, you know, as you have staff, I mean, we're always happy to help assist with any of that. So yeah, I don't know how we get that on a regular schedule, but I think it would be really great.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out some way to make that happen. You know, I know we have some folks from other Park Service units that are on Zoom. And because we've had a discussion beforehand about that, but that's one of the things that I think we as a service need to get kind of into this whole kind of review process a little more steadily.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect opportunity for partnerships with USGS, because you guys are the experts at it, you know,
Yeah.
you do that, so.
I mean, the partnership through the NETN has been, you know, that's always helpful too, and the NRPP, I don't know, maybe it's just not as exciting as some of the new projects, but it's definitely critical. All right, well, we can continue to do questions, but just sort of moving into the next bit here. So after the 2021 storm where you had the massive erosion issues, you all reached out and said, you know, how can we put together a framework to mitigate stream flood vulnerability? And so we all met together on Zoom. Was it last year? Maybe, I don't know. We put together this concept proposal of things that we thought were important in terms of getting our heads around stream flood vulnerability. So these are the 5 tasks that we laid out. And so the first was assess ecosystem vulnerability, and that's the erosion. There's the poster child picture with Brian that shows up everywhere, right? And then the task 2 is to assess the infrastructure vulnerability. And then task 3 was collect those high stream flow data measurements and get a handle on that. And task 4, develop a hydraulic design tool. We're doing that in Massachusetts, actually, for culvert and bridge replacement. We did a watershed. We're gonna be going statewide where, you know, it's a point and click, kind of like Stream Stats, where you can get an initial culvert design and, you know, more for the towns, the counties, the folks that don't have an engineer on staff that need that. So that, you know, if you ever want to hear more about that, we could always do a presentation on that. It's a big project in our center. And then task 5 would be to incorporate climate change into some of these hydrologic and hydraulic designs. And so this most recent NRPP project that we're just getting going on, we are tackling task 1 and task 2, which is assessing the ecosystem vulnerability and the infrastructure vulnerability. And so I'm gonna let these folks talk for a minute. So task 1, Adam Bentham, I don't know, actually, is Adam on the line? I'm not sure. He's not, okay. So Adam and Nina are working together on this task 1. Do you wanna just talk a little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, so this is the assessing ecosystem vulnerability. So we're taking the data that we're getting from you guys, and it's super helpful. Taking that all into consideration, updating our hydrography based on LiDAR. So we pulled new LiDAR files. We were able to get an update from Karen on when those were released. We want to compare those with the 2010 as well. So we've kind of mosaiced all those together so we can process what we need to. And this kind of shows, this image here kind of shows what one of those areas would look like. This was the carriage road to the west of Jordan Pond here, where that washout occurred in 2021. So we're using this updated information to find out the stream steepness and the channel incision normalized for drainage area for each stream reach. So we'll be assessing each of those culverts at those areas and using all the database information that we're getting from you guys. So it's just kind of creating this complete model system based on updated information that we're getting from multiple sources to get the best available vulnerability assessment for the culverts. And getting what we can for the measurements is super helpful because we're not just using our information from the LiDAR and where the locations are, but we need to know exactly what type of culverts we're working with, the roads and all these structures that are included in this database.
Yeah, and this first piece is really about also just the erosion vulnerability. So these channel incision and so Adam also is, you know, is a geomorphologist and has done this type of it's really a GIS analysis, but really looking at the some of those metrics that you can compute using just a GIS type analysis. So that is task 1 that is underway. And then task 2, Megan can talk a minute about that.
Yeah, I'm Megan, I'm a hydrologist, New England Water Science Center. And so yeah, our second task is more looking at the infrastructure, so looking at the culverts and bridges, and kind of compiling an inventory based on the data that you all have. So we were just talking to Keith for this, trying to get a little bit more data there. As well as data from the state of Maine, Nature Conservancy, and other sources. And so that will include, you know, things about the historical importance of structures, washout history, kind of the ecological importance, or those are designed better for aquatic organism passage. So that's kind of like one component of it is compiling all of that data into a useful database. And the second part of it is actually computing the design flows through the culverts and kind of determining if the sizing is adequate for current and future flows. And so hopefully through that, we'll have a really useful database that can help prioritize where you all would want to maintain or replace culverts so that, we're not experiencing, these big washout scenarios where a lot of material is getting into the very important streams and stuff here. So, yeah.
And they never were able to get you into FMSS, is that right?
We looked a little bit at it today on the projector.
We have a system that she needs access to, which because you're in USGS, doesn't matter that
We're not just partners, we're all in the.
You're not allowed.
Well, Megan might just have to come back,
Yeah.
work out of here, for a few days, if need be.
Sign a non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah, exactly, I know. Nothing will leave the site except it's encrypted.
So frustrating.
Well, I appreciate you all trying.
But also just looking at how these first two tasks integrate together, you know, do we have erodible reaches that are upstream of culverts that can't pass a design flow and or downstream of a culvert, and where are those locations where things are coming together in a way that's, you know, so if we can prioritize, somehow have different ways that you can prioritize some of your projects, that would be great. And so we do have a project page up about this project with everybody's contact information. And we'll be, you know, in contact with you throughout this project. You know, this is definitely a collaborative thing. It stems from, and the whole NRPP is you all putting forth, you know, what your needs are and us trying to help meet some of them. So that is what we have for presentation, but we are happy to take any other questions.
Why don't you just describe a little bit about the next phase, the data collection? You know, of the concept proposal, because you talked about the crest stage gauges and how that would kind of feed in, because I can see that as being our next, like if we want to
Yeah.
accomplish some of the next tasks, the next proposal that we probably want to do is to start that data collection stuff.
Yeah,
So what would that look like as far as what we would need to do to, and how does that differ from what we've already accomplished?
I mean, continuous record stream gauges are really, you know, the best way. So I mean, that, you know, continuing otter and, you know, if there's a way to get another gauge, you know, just at sort of looking at different settings and different basic characteristics, but to then expand the network. So the crest stage gauge network is a much more sort of affordable option. You know, it's, you know, you're putting in this big tube and it's just capturing the stage of the high flow. So you can go out after every storm and, you know, measure up to from that reference location. And then you also need to build a rating at those sites. So we would need to come out, just like at our continuous record sites, and build that stage discharge measurement rating by measuring the stream flow at a range of flows. So it's a lot less lower tech. It's a lot lower tech because you don't have, you know, it's not on the web, it's not in real time, it's sort of, but then you can do more of a peak flow analysis. But I mean, I guess we really need to see what the questions are and design the network around that, just like we did for the low flows, because is that going to answer your question about timing and about runoff and all of that? It's really more the continuous record type. And, you know, there are some lower tech options that people are starting to look at and some of those. But I think if that's something that you're interested in, we should really get our data folks. We should have Nick and Greg out here and really design it. But I think the first step would be to say, what questions do you want to answer? You know, obviously we start with that and then design the network to meet those needs. But they're going to be able to tell you more about what equipment and what the network might look like more specifically. But happy to do that anytime. You know, they're coming out here for Otter Creek anyways, so.
We always like to have you guys here.
That's nice. But yeah, it does seem like as we're facing these flooding issues, that's something that we'd want to get a little bit more of a handle on. Just because the whole Great Meadow project, I just banged my head against the wall for so long, trying to get at the hydrology for that. It was not easy, like our usual tools were sort of struggling a little bit. But keep otter. That's the one thing to take away. If you can, keep otter.
Well, we're grateful that FOA, our partner, has stepped up and they help support keeping otter.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
That's a challenge, but
Stephanie's on the line.
Stephanie, thank you.
You're welcome. Hopefully we can keep it going.
Yes.
Yeah, and it really fills out our network too, you know, to have something out here. So it's really great. And I think, and I'm happy to come and do this presentation because this, looking at those correlations and looking how well it does as an index gauge, you know, it's meeting the objective, so that's great.
Makes us feel good about the streams that we selected.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, the
first
partial
one.
record stations, yeah. That we were able to get decent correlations, yeah. I'm pretty pleased with it.
Can you talk a little bit about the project in Massachusetts and how you're working with communities in the state? I mean, are you doing some of that in Maine as well? Is that?
So this is, yeah, it's called our Stream Crossings Project, and we also have a project page. If you want to go and explore that, we have a little bit of a story map type thing for that project, but it's coming up. So we do a lot of our hydraulic modeling with our HEC-RAS, which is our hydraulic model program, and so we're kind of breaking the code and trying to get in there and automate some of that process. You know, usually we do models, we go in there by hand and we're doing a lot of detailed work and we're surveying and stuff, but this is getting the information we need from the LiDAR, all automated, coming up with several culvert designs. Megan's been working a bit on this, and that meet both the stream crossing standards, you know, and meet the design needs for the design flows, and coming up with a couple different culvert designs. And, you know, there's no replacement for, you know, on the site analysis and stuff, but it's a really good start. So that, I mean, I think the problem is, you know, you have a big flood and then they just go and replace the culvert with the same size because they don't have enough time to do it. And so this is like, okay, well, here's a start. This is what you should be looking at. And so, and it will be a point and click for the communities that don't have that.
Just on that,
Oh, sorry.
how do you?
Then Catherine has a question on that.
How do you do step 5 to that, or task 5?
The climate
Yes, that was the
change.
exact question I was trying to answer. It's for one of our kind of partners in the park. It was like, you know, here's, you did all this modeling for Great Meadow. You came up with your culvert design. How do you incorporate climate change into that? I'm just like, well, it's designed using modeling of current conditions. So how do you then?
Well, I mean, honestly, we don't even have a good handle on current conditions. So without even knowing what the hydrology is right now, it's really hard to predict what it's going to be in the future. But I mean, you know, we do watershed models, we do precipitation runoff models, KRMS models, and you can put in projections for rain fall and temperature and those things. So you can do a very detailed hydrologic model for an area like that, and that's based on. And so we have a lot of projects, and that's really how we're getting at a lot of our climate change. We have another hydro risk project that's sort of getting and trying to reintroduce some of the error into some of those equations that our equations don't really take the extremes into account all the time. So it's getting those extremes and putting them back into our equations and our estimates. But yeah, I would say, I'm sorry, that's a non-answer, but it's like if we don't understand it now, I mean, that's the first step, right?
Yeah. So Catherine Schmidt has a question online. Catherine, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for the presentation, Pam. My question is about the culvert surveys, and if there's been any talk of having volunteers helping with that. I know when the Nature Conservancy and others had a statewide push to survey for fish passage barriers, they engaged a lot of volunteers, and this seems like an opportunity for some citizen science.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly look at that. I mean, we are mostly for this project dealing with existing data. We're not doing a lot of field work for this project. So it's looking at using the Nature Conservancy inventory, using any other inventories we got, trying to get any more updated information from Keith, which is what you were doing today. And but it's not a huge field effort for this. We're not going to be going out and surveying a bunch of culverts for this project right now. We're using existing information. But in terms of, you know, updating what we have, you know, that might be a thing. But I like the idea though.
So if somebody wants, if you're using this, we're going to replace a culvert, do you have like a range of, if you build it to this size, it'll be good for those 10-year events?
Yeah,
and if you build it to that size, it'll be good for 1,000-year events? Or, I mean, is that kind of some of the range of
So we'll put
information?
like a flood risk attribute on each culvert. And so that, you know, like you can go into stream stats and click on any stream and it will tell you what the 50-year storm is or the 100-year storm. And we want to assign that as an attribute to each culvert. So that will be in the database and say, and so, you know, you can choose what design flow that, you know, you want your culverts to meet. And so then you'd be able to sort your data by, you know, which ones can pass a 50-year storm, or which ones can pass a 25-year storm, as they are now. And yeah, so absolutely, the flood risk will be, and so, and the Nature Conservancy database, we just talked to them because we were trying to, you know, collaborate and make sure we're using each other's information as best possible. They have a flood risk score, but it's not quite as vigorous as using to, you know, they're not computing, well, they're computing the design storms.
It's a little.
Yeah, we're just trying to figure out exactly how they did their flood risk score, and so we're getting a handle on this, but I think ours will be a little bit more rigorous in terms of, you know, just applying our regression equations to them.
And so do you have a way of, you know, you're talking about culverts, do you have a way of handling a bunch of our infrastructure is like in the stream, like particularly our trails, right? Like the Maple Spring Trail that washed out, like there was the stream, right? Or the stream bank was the trail. Is there a way of handling that kind of vulnerability in this kind of assessment? We have a handful of, well, we have a bunch of trails that at least have stretches that are in the stream bed itself.
Oh, the trail is in the stream.
What's the answer, Jason?
There's no culvert, the trail, like, so the Maple Spring Trail, which washed out in this big storm, like the stretch that's washed out, like a bunch of the trail was in the stream. It was just like rocks, big rocks that were placed, or it was on the immediate stream bank, like it was.
So
It was
don't
just-
take the trail during a flood.
But we're rebuilding that trail, so in the stream, again.
Because of its historic
And-
character.
It was the historic character, and so I think having some way of, so that will be a need, because obviously those are vulnerable to washing out. And then, but I don't know how, if we have a way of knowing, like, what kind of circumstances would lead to it actually washing out, or how.
Well, yeah, that ecosystem
Right.
vulnerability. I mean, so that's the geomorphic vulnerability that Adam and me are gonna be working on, that, you know, so which stretches of trail are most vulnerable to that type of washout, and yeah.
So that's anyhow, at least in your assessment, if you're able to include those, it's an infrastructure that's won't show up in a culvert report, but it's
Right.
really important for us to be thinking about.
It will show up on our LiDAR. And
Yeah.
from 2021, it'll show what it was before. You're currently rebuilding it now. And with the modeling that Adam and I could do, we'd be able to see and you'd be able to model in what type of weather event would affect that and where that would go. And then those would be your vulnerable points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad we don't have Adam on the call.
I know,
Yeah, he's our geomorphologist, so,
So the trail,
but,
so when the trail's within a sensitive area for over a mile, that's the indicator.
Right, but what's funny is like, what do we do with that? Because clearly we're.
It depends who you ask. You are rebuilding in the time.
But now we know.
Right.
We know the answer, whether we use the answer or not is another
That's a policy
question.
decision that takes place in a different room.
But that assessment should go into the decision-making.
Yes.
Right, and if we are able to think about it ahead of time, that would help us be less reactive.
so who should Adam reach out to about talking about some of this stuff? If he would like to have that conversation with
I
him.
think they got all the information, if they got all that, I'm stressed.
If you have the trails and you have our streams,
Yeah, have a problem.
like they should,
You're
they
probably
lay on
figuring
top of
it
each other.
And we're gonna visit that this afternoon. That's on our list, so. I
Our
think-
trails crew could probably anecdotally say where they have issues, where they're having to do work. And so.
Well, if the trail, you know, if you just mark the points on a map, I mean, that would be, any information they can provide would be helpful, like, you know.
I sit down with Chris,
That one.
Dave, and Jeff would probably.
So we'll ping you if, like, if we don't, yeah.
So I think working with Jason, is that okay?
Yeah.
Working with Jason and then to connect with the trails crew. But
No, I think that would be really interesting to incorporate that.
yeah. Those are washout. It's a different kind of washout than the culvert. The culvert washout is catastrophic in terms of taking a ton of crap downstream.
But I can't stress how important this is, because the maintenance office right now is actively going through the loop road. And they just, like, even when we talk to engineers, they're always engineering to, like, the 10-year drainage system, and we just can't change it without.
To get it up to,
Yeah, so like they're actively like building and designing and building, designing. And like,
There may be another.
you know, the railroad stream, which is like the Cadillac stream. Is that how it's- But they're like, yeah, like those are all ones that are like active in their design.
well, yeah, the stream crossings tool, it's, you know, they're trying to keep the designs all without raising the roadbed, you know, which is, but I'm not sure that, I think that criteria is getting shifted a little bit, yeah.
So we just have to wrap up because there's another meeting in here,
Okay.
but thank you very much.
Well, thanks
guys,
for coming, it was great
in.
turnout.
Really
Thank you so much.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it's nice to be here.